He was on the wild, he was out of control.
This guy with wrecking balls at the end of his wrists. He's become a national institution. Proof that a human being can actually be one person and then transform and be another person in another state.
Hallelujah, I'm born again.
He had plenty of anger before he became famous.
George Foreman's story is anybody can. It's a tremendous success story.
In the immediate post-war years, America was a country of growing power, wealth, and prestige. War veterans were enabled to go to college, and more white Americans than ever could look forward to a life of comfort and financial security. This prosperity, however, didn't apply to George Edward Foreman. He was born in Houston, Texas, on January the 10th, 1949, into a world of poverty and deprivation.
George always used to like to use the word poor. Because, you know, to be poor means you may have had a little something, but we had nothing. So we were poor. It was P-O, and that's about as far as it went.
George, nicknamed Monkey, was the fifth of Nancy Ree Nelson's 7 children. She was the daughter of a sharecropper from Marshall, Texas. Nancy moved to Houston and did 2 jobs as a cook in order to feed her children.
She came home one night, and just all she had was this hamburger. And she looked at George. That was the hamburger right there by itself. He could have swallowed that whole thing. But she knew that everybody had to eat that night. So she sat down, and somehow or another, she came up with 7 slices.
Nancy was a woman of quiet strength who looked after her large family more or less on her own. George adored her. Even when very little, he dreamed of making her life easier.
He had an enormous amount of respect for her. There wasn't anything that he wouldn't do for her, and I really don't think there wasn't anything she wouldn't do for him.
Nancy was married to J.D. Foreman, but it wasn't an ideal match. J.D. worked on the railway, drank too much, and was rarely in residence. When he did come home, he was a caring father, and he always predicted a bright future for George.
He used to always pat George on the head. And he says, George Foreman, next heavyweight champion of the world. Wasn't even boxing.
George got along well with his brothers and sisters, but he became furious if they called him Moorhead, a nickname he disliked but didn't yet understand. The family lived in the 5th Ward, the toughest part of Houston, often referred to as the Bloody Fifth. It was poverty-stricken, a haphazard collection of shacks where only rats and violence thrived. Nancy relied strongly on religion in her struggle to bring up her kids to become decent people. George, however, had no interest in the church, and in the violent Fifth, there were few role models worth looking up to.
It was very, very difficult for him, and he developed certain habits that he wasn't very proud of. I don't know if George had any real heroes at that time.
He did have one, the great Cleveland Browns running back, Jim Brown. George wanted to play football like him. George was in the team at E.O. Smith Junior High School. He was a good player, but a bad student, constantly playing truant. Then he dropped out altogether.
People back there at E.O. Smith didn't think we could learn. Everybody thought we had this old hoodlum ways, hoodlum mentality. Teachers in school, you can't learn, you ain't gonna do this, you ain't gonna amount to nothing.
George had no ambitions for the future. He just hung out, had a short-lived job as a mover, and spent a lot of time with his younger brother.
We used to sit on the porch a lot, and we played this game where, you know, cars would pass by, and we said, that's my car. And the next car come by, that's my car, next one be yours, right? But I always got the old cars, and he always got the new ones.
George was gentle with his brother, but on the streets he was a menace.
He liked to fight a lot. And him and his friends, they would have like little gang fights. Everybody would be scared, you know, they think he's gonna do something to them or jump on him. They'll have those big chains and swords, and boy, they be at it.
George and his friends often got drunk. They burgled houses and mugged people in the street. They were constantly in trouble, and the police were always after them.
I would start stealing. I was a mugger, teenage thug, really. Had dropped out of high school, no chances at all.
The way my life was going, with George and I was hanging out, running the streets, and the way our life was going, at 21, we'd been in prison.
We are going to build a great society.
But George's life of crime was cut short by President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Johnson was trying to combat poverty with schemes offering educational opportunities and training programs. George happened to see a public service announcement for the Job Corps program on television. He and his friends signed up immediately. George was 16 when he left the bloody Fifth for the first time in his life. He flew to Oregon. The outside world that he had only seen in picture books became a reality when he and his friend Roy arrived at the Job Corps camp in Grants Pass.
Trees, it was completely wilderness. Looked like bear or something could come out the woods any second. You know, that was it. A lion, a cub, anything could come out the woods then. And that's where we were. It was a brand new adventure. We were very excited. We were more like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, huh?
In safe surroundings and with 3 solid meals a day, George and Roy had a chance to sort themselves out. They also got another chance of education. Lots of encouragement and supervision produced rapid results, and their marks reflected it.
They start cramming us with academics and books and stuff like that, and they said, yeah, you can, and you can. Next thing I know, we took test after test, and we was, hey, y'all ready to move on? I said, thanks, Jesus.
6 months later, they were transferred to a camp in Pleasanton, California, for on-the-job training. George and some others took electronics courses. His work improved, but not his behavior. George was quick to pick fights with fellow students, and he got himself into serious trouble.
But what happened was I was down at the gym, and they called me and says, Doc, please come and help us. I says, for what? And said, we got a corpsman up here we can't do nothing with.
George was about to be expelled, but Doc knew that troubled kids often behaved badly just to get attention. He decided to give George one last chance.
I said to him, I says, man, like you make a good boxer. You big enough, you ugly enough, and you should make a good boxer.
Doc took charge of the wild young man and began to train him.
He was mean, and he didn't believe in nothing. He only believed in himself.
Doc directed George's fist to the punch bag. Boxing cooled his temper.
It sounded like he found a girlfriend. He found something that he really loved and he really was excited about, and he was enthused about.
But George had no idea of making a career out of boxing. He graduated from the Job Corps after 2 years, and against Doc's advice, he returned to Houston to get a job. He seemed to be a changed man.
His nickname was Monkey. When he came back to town, he was George Foreman. And my mother had to, readjust herself and hoping that even though, since he had become this George Foreman person again, that he could keep that and not go back into the monkey.
But he did. In spite of the government's equal opportunity policies, it was still very difficult for a young black man to find a job. When George failed, he went back to the streets. His mother was desperately worried about a son who was 18, idle and too strong for his own good. Doc, too, was concerned. He wanted George back in the ring, so he rang George's mother.
Well, I said, Miss Nancy, where's your son at? He said, Doc, I don't know. I said, you find him. She says, well, I want him back out here, so as soon as I get through talking to you, I'm sending him a ticket. Come out here and I'll take care of him. Just like that, she said, thank God I found somebody that takes interest in my son.
George went back to Pleasanton, and Doc trained him hard. Doc had high ambitions. He dreamed of sending his protege to the Olympic Games. George had no idea of the recognition that a medal could bring, but Doc told him about Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, who had both won Olympic gold.
I explained it to him and everything, and I said, man, do you realize you win the gold medal, what'll happen? You'll be the talk of the town. It's like, his eyes lit up, and he's...
The 1968 Olympics were only a year away, but Doc promised George he'd make him one hell of a boxer in the time. He entered him in half a dozen fights. George won them all. Doc kept pushing his career. He persuaded the ring announcer to put George's picture in the paper before an imminent match.
First time I'd ever heard his name. George was brand new. He had only been in a boxing ring for a couple of months at that time. And he was fighting a man who was a professional amateur by the name of Clay Hodges.
George lost to Hodges, who was a much smaller fighter.
And boy, it was embarrassing. I said to myself, I'll never do this again.
I walked back to the dressing room, and here's George sitting on the rubbing table with his chin literally on his chest. The word sad in the dictionary, that was George. And I patted him on those massive shoulders and said, you know, pat, pat, pat. Don't worry about it, George. You're going to be a good fighter someday.
George kept fighting and subsequently knocked out all his opponents. With his devastating punch, he accumulated the remarkable record of 16 victories in 18 bouts. On the strength of this, the 19-year-old boxer earned a place in the American Olympic team. It seemed he might amount to something after all. In October 1968, George Foreman, a wild kid from the slums of Houston, was among the elite of athletes at the Olympic Games in Mexico City. George, the fighting corpsman, as he called himself, survived his early bouts to become a gold medal contender.
When I got a chance to really go to the Olympics, I knew then that I was the prime representative of the American team. I knew that.
In 1968, it was complicated for blacks to represent their country because America was in the middle of the civil rights struggle.
We were fighting for our freedom, equality, and justice, for something that we all deserve to have, you know, our freedom in this country. And so some people call it turmoil, I call it revolution.
The revolution claimed victims. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and the nation's capital went up in flames. In June, Robert Kennedy, the presidential candidate and an ardent advocate of social justice, was also assassinated. The hope that Great Society programs would eliminate poverty and racism had turned to bitterness. The Black Panthers, a radical separatist group, urged black athletes to protest by boycotting the Olympics. George Foreman was unaware of the controversy until the American sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their clenched fists in the Black Power salute. The gesture was seen as courageous by many African Americans, but as anti-American by many whites. The two athletes were dismissed from the Olympic Village, and the expulsion put the other black athletes in a quandary. The press was eager to know what George was going to do.
Whatever he does, it'll be a credit to him, a credit to his people, his race, also a credit to the world, whatever he does.
At a time of high tension in the Cold War, George had to fight the Soviet heavyweight Ioannis Chapoulis for the gold medal.
And boy, we said, oh my goodness, he's fighting a Russian. First thing I thought of, if he beats the Russians gonna drop a bomb on us. So quite naturally, I was afraid. I said, well, maybe he won't beat the Russian and then it won't be a war.
The Russian was the more accomplished boxer.
Now we'll see whether or not the experience of the Soviet fighter shows.
But the greater experience couldn't match the force of George's hammer blows.
Oh, left, right first, then a left, then another right. Good combination.
The fight had to be stopped. George had won.
Over to the corner, the technical term. Referee stops contest. George Foreman.
The spectators were waiting to see whether he too was going to give the Black Power salute.
Everybody was sitting there tensed. You hear a pin drop.
And George, this now 19-year-old George Foreman, who's still a rookie, you know, he took out the little American flag and he bowed to all four sides.
The whole place erupted. That shocked the whole entire world, not just the United States, the whole entire world.
George was now the big story. His photograph was everywhere.
We saw the picture in the newspaper with him waving that flag. George was Olympic heavyweight champion. And then I realized that if a bomb was going to be dropped, they would have dropped it. It hadn't happened.
We're very proud of him. You know, we couldn't believe that he really did something out of his life.
The gold medal was public proof of George Foreman's achievement and his proudest possession. He showed it off so often that the ribbon wore out and had to be replaced. He had become a symbol of American patriotism and was criticized by the radical black community who called him an Uncle Tom. Nevertheless, his victory gained him an invitation from President Johnson to visit the White House.
The impossible kept happening. He was the father of this Job Corps. And I remember the President Johnson looking at me as if to say, look, I've given you the baton. It had not been for the Job Corps, I was literally rescued from the gutter.
In 1969, George announced his decision to turn professional, hoping that one day his awesome punch would win him the heavyweight championship.
A lot of people would be afraid of me.
He began to train with the ex-champion and convicted felon Sonny Liston, well known for his intimidating stare.
I came to believe early on that George had acquired some of Sonny's characteristics directly from Sonny. He learned how to glower, and he learned how to punch.
George, the charming, flag-waving Olympian, was now a career boxer with a mean and sinister new look.
George is doing his best imitation of Sonny Liston. All of a sudden you have this stare coming at you. But George was that insecure, which might be why he adopted that persona of that surly person, because he didn't know what he was.
George's life was now devoted to boxing and building a career that would give him a chance of the heavyweight title. It required a tough training program, early nights, no drinking, smoking or carousing, and above all, no romantic distractions. The strict regime paid dividends. George won fight after fight, glaring at his opponents before knocking them out. He was obedient to the rules until he met Adrienne Calhoun in August 1970.
I got kind of afraid of him when I first saw him. I saw that nose, and I thought his nose has been broken, I think, and he looks like he's pretty rough. But he wasn't. He was just a fighter. All he thought about was boxing and wanting to be heavyweight champion. He was very kind and very shy, and that's what really did attract me.
They started to meet in secret.
He was every bit a gentleman. He'd hide things in my little gifts in my purse. Or, I remember we went to the movie and we saw the love story. And George cried like a baby in the movie.
It was a difficult courtship. Adrienne, who lived and worked in Minneapolis, tried to join George wherever he was training, but she always had to hide from the trainers. She began to feel like a groupie and so persuaded George to marry her.
And we got all the way down to the courthouse to get our license, and he did not want to take the blood test because he's afraid of needles. And I thought, oh my goodness, we're not going to be able to get married.
George was late for the wedding, but they did manage to tie the knot in December 1971. The honeymoon was brief. George returned to the ring where he fought with ferocious determination, annihilating his opponents. By the time he got to his heavyweight title bout, he had won all his 37 professional fights, 34 of them by a knockout.
He was able to put his punches together. Like, for example, any of his fights, when he scored those big knockouts, he would really brutalize the guy before he got him out of there.
In December 1972, George took leave of Adrienne, who was heavily pregnant, and flew to Kingston, Jamaica to bid for the heavyweight title. His opponent was the current champion, Joe Frazier. George was not expected to survive Frazier's mighty left hook. In spite of his record, George was not rated highly by sports writers.
Because Joe Frazier had beaten Muhammad Ali and was undefeated, they didn't see how this young kid, who really just threw punches this way, not snapping them, could win.
I was still afraid of Joe Frazier. He was smoking Joe Frazier. That means when the bell rang, he said, I come out smoking. And I had seen evidence that nothing could stop him. You hit him, he liked it.
The fight took place on January the 22nd, 1973. George faced the ultimate challenge of his 3-year professional career.
I remember that the left hook of Joe Frazier sounded like a bullet. So this was some tiger of a champion.
Foreman wasn't intimidated.
It's target practice for George Foreman.
George was powerful. There's no doubt about that. And he was out there to get me. He was dropping death charges on me, man. I couldn't survive him.
And almost with his first punch, he had a man on the floor 7 times. It was like a ball bouncing up and down.
It is over. It is over.
Before the end of the second round, the fight was stopped.
The hardest guy I've faced. And I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it.
It was absolutely devastating. No one could believe it. And from that point on, George was regarded as invincible.
It was the fight that changed George Foreman's life. He was 24 years old and the new heavyweight champion of the world. He was also a dad. Adrienne had given birth to a girl, Michi, who instantly became a baby celebrity.
I remember seeing my child for the first time in Kingston, Jamaica, by way of a newspaper clipping. And I remember looking at that face as though I had known her all my life.
George was every bit the proud father when he arrived in Minneapolis to spend some time with his new daughter.
He just held her and just stared at her, and he was in love with her. And it looked like this giant with this little small baby. But he wasn't going to get up with her at night because he thought he heard something go crunch when he picked her up. He thought he broke her arm.
The reunion was not as idyllic as Adrienne had hoped. George was now a celebrity, and the couple was besieged by reporters.
I thought, I haven't seen him for 6 weeks. I want to be with my husband. We got our baby, and people wouldn't leave us alone. And I just threw a tantrum after a while. I just threw my hands, just told everybody, just leave. I didn't realize that this was what it was going to be like from here on out.
In just over 5 years, George Foreman had punched his way from gutter to glory. He was at the top of his game, and failure seemed far away. At 24, George Foreman had become the heavyweight champion of the world in 1973. He had become richer and more famous than he had ever imagined possible.
His dream as a young boy, as far as wealth was concerned, was to have $1,500. He said $1,500 in my hand at one time.
Reality exceeded George's wildest dreams. He was making and spending lots of money. He bought a house for his mother, paid for his brother Roy to go to college, and collected not only dogs, but exotic animals that cost thousands of dollars. He could also afford to indulge his taste for fast women and fast cars. Suddenly, there was nothing George Foreman could not afford to buy. In the ring, he was riding a wave, successfully defending his title against Joe Roman in Tokyo and Ken Norton in Venezuela. It was his private life that was problematic. George's first priority was his career, and he trained in California. But Adrienne had a career of her own in Minneapolis, and the family lived apart. He tried to combine boxing with fatherhood by summoning his daughter to be with him when it suited him.
I was beginning to feel like an employee. I really was. Like he said, bring the baby to me. Now he's not coming to the airport.
She also correctly suspected that there were other women in George's life and became resentful. He imagined other men in Adrienne's life and arrived at her house unannounced.
He tore up the whole house. He has this gun out, and he took the phone bill because he wanted to see who I had been talking to long distance, and that was a time when I was afraid of him.
George didn't touch Adrienne, but the marriage was beyond reconciliation, and in 1974, it ended in divorce.
I didn't get married to divorce. We just didn't get along because we were both very forceful people. It was a real devastating, it was very, very hard for me.
George's fortunes, on the other hand, continued to soar as he signed an unprecedented $5 million contract to fight Muhammad Ali in Zaire. Everything was going George's way. The 25-year-old champion seemed to have it all. But before long, he too would learn what devastation felt like. In the autumn of 1974, George Foreman arrived in Zaire with a Bible in his suitcase for good luck. The newly independent country had prohibited Western names and clothes and was rejoicing in its ancient African heritage. George looked forward to finding his roots.
I think we were all searching for something. I thought that I would even find it again in Africa, find what I was searching for.
George was the reigning title holder, but his challenger and former champion, Muhammad Ali, still held the world's attention. Then 32, Ali was past his prime as a boxer, but he had become a worldwide hero. As a young man, he had changed his so-called slave name, Clay, to Muhammad Ali, and converted to Islam. Ali became legendary when he refused to be drafted to Vietnam and was stripped of his heavyweight title. Since then, he had rarely left the headlines.
But I do predict I'll be twice as fast.
And the favorite of the people of Zaire.
5 times to 1, I'll completely outclass him.
He went around to all the people in Zaire and told them, I'm the greatest, I did this, I'm the greatest, George is nothing.
And there were rumors that Ali was paying witch doctors to put curses on George. So George was uncomfortable. He was suspicious that everyone was trying to do something to destroy him. He wouldn't even talk to me.
George surrounded himself with Zairean secret police and became distrustful and uncommunicative. Meanwhile, Ali kept talking.
After 8 good rounds, it'll be obvious that he's dead tired.
Everyone knew that Ali was a skillful fighter, but many feared that he would crumble under Foreman's heavy blows.
People were really, really afraid of what was going to happen in that fight. There were people literally fearing for Ali's life.
The big day was October the 30th, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, scheduled for the convenience of American television, the bout for the heavyweight title was about to begin. Foreman came out aggressively and threw punch after punch. Few landed due to the new rope-a-dope technique that Muhammad Ali adopted. He leaned back on the ropes to conserve his energy, while George wildly threw 6 punches for every one of Ali's.
He hit him once in the middle of the forehead, and Ali's eyes rolled like that, like they were slot machines. He went tick, 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 tick. You thought money'd start coming out of his mouth, you know? But that was the most he ever hit him.
George was getting tired and frustrated. In the 8th round, he found himself where he had never been before, on the canvas.
Foreman down. This is almost incredible.
It seemed like witchcraft.
Too late. It's over.
The fight was over. Against all expectations, Muhammad Ali had taken the title from George Foreman.
George should have beat Ali if he'd listened, but he didn't listen. He wanted to destroy Ali like a hoodlum in the street. He reverted back.
It was the first defeat of George's professional career. He did not take it well.
George wouldn't admit to himself that he lost. He thought that he was still the champion of the world. And he kept saying, I'm still the champion. I don't think I lost. Well, George lost.
Defeat sent him into depression, and he became surlier than ever.
By knowing George, yeah, it hurt him real good because he don't like losing. He don't like losing because he puts too much into winning.
Winning is everything, and losing is absolutely nothing. And when I say nothing, there has to be a word to even go deeper than nothing, but I don't think so. Absolutely nothing. It devastated my whole life from top to bottom. It was hard even to sleep. You think I'm not even a man anymore.
Being no longer the champion, George ceased to know who he was at all.
I got the impression George was just spiraling out of control. He had no base, he had no focus, he had no, if you will, guiding point on his own personal compass. He was out of control.
George seemed determined to convince himself and the world that he was still a winner by conquering lots of women. But he already had too many women in his life. Even before the divorce from Adrienne, there was a pregnant girlfriend. Soon after that was yet another woman and another child. George's shaky sense of self was given another jolt when he learned why his siblings had called him Moorhead. Leroy Moorhead, a World War II veteran, was his biological father. George was 27 when they met, just 2 years before Leroy's death in 1978.
I pursued and found him. I really did. But I never found the love that I had in J.D. Foreman.
George couldn't develop a strong bond with his biological father and continued to struggle with his own identity. He became more depressed than ever, and the only thing that kept him going was the longing to be champion again.
Nothing would cure me. The only thing that would cure me is if I would become heavyweight champ of the world again.
George Foreman, 217.
His 13th fight on the road back to the title was against Jimmy Young in Puerto Rico on March the 17th, 1977. Young was not expected to survive Foreman for long.
But I intend to be champion.
I said, George, just go out and throw a right hand to the body and a left hook to the chin and let's get out of here.
George didn't listen, and in the 100-degree tropical heat, the fight went all 12 rounds. He had demonstrated amazing stamina, but lost on points. Exhausted and dehydrated, George went back to his dressing room. Everyone was concerned.
Everybody, oh, that's okay, man. You know, you'll come back. It was just a fight. But then all of a sudden, things started happening in that room.
George's knees gave way under him, and he said he heard God's voice telling him he was going to die.
But I just didn't believe in religion. I don't want to die. I hadn't said goodbye to my mother. I had a baby. I had a hidden safety deposit box, keys, different places. I've hidden money. I'm not going to die. I'm George Foreman.
George was clearly agitated. He started to quote the Bible. All around him were mystified.
We all scratched that. Everybody scratched it, looked at each other. And so quite natural, we thought, well, he didn't get hit that hard in the ring, so it can't be anything wrong with his mind.
I was screaming, I'm dying, but tell everybody I'm dying for God. Within a split second, I was dead. I was in a deep, dark nothing. I looked around and saw everything I'd ever worked for just crumble like trash.
Everybody was trying to hold him, and he was jumping up. He says, I'm bleeding, you know, right where Jesus bled, in my hands and my feet. You know, wash it off me, wash it off.
Foreman's trainers suspected heat prostration and managed to get him into the shower.
I started screaming words I'd never used before. Hallelujah, I'm clean. I've been born again.
He was rushed to hospital. The press was told that Foreman had been overcome by the heat, but George felt he had suffered more than a momentary blackout. In his view, he had died and been born again. It completely changed his outlook, and he began to make a new and entirely different life for himself. First, he gave up boxing. At 31, he left the career that had made him rich and famous. His friends thought he had finally lost his mind completely.
I was disturbed when he talking about he finna quit boxing. Oh man, to me that was the ultimate blow. You can't. He said, yes I can.
The Bible was now George's consuming passion. His evangelistic zeal was unrelenting, and he couldn't wait to save the ones he loved.
He come like a rushing wind, and he start hollering and say, Leo, we got to be baptized again. We got to be baptized in Jesus' name. If we didn't get baptized, we was going to hell. So I say, Mama, what is wrong with him? What is wrong? And she started crying, and I started crying, and I'm about to do it again.
The profound religious experience made George a model of humility, who lived modestly on the interest of his fortune. For the next 10 years, his life was entirely directed by his faith. The depth of his Christian commitment was vast. In 1978, George became an ordained minister of the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ. He took his ministry to the streets.
You know, you got people all over this country, but I'm crazy.
Houston motorists stopping for a red light might sometimes catch sight of a huge man with a microphone, exhorting them to turn to Christ.
They were surprised and they were shocked also. And they looked at him and they'd say, that's the boxer?
George said he was catching fish for the Lord. He had a bus waiting to take converts to the river to be baptized.
They pulled the church bus right as close as they could get to the river. It was pitch black, and they had to leave the headlights of the bus on so they could see. And George walked down into those freezing waters, and one by one, he baptized 6 or 7 people. This is serious stuff.
Oh, Jesus, God, as you ask that you move.
George had found spiritual bedrock. He felt he'd acquired the true meaning in his life that had eluded him for so long.
Hallelujah, I'm clean. Hallelujah, I'm born again.
In 1980, he established his own church. He also preached in prisons and bought time on the radio to deliver his message. It was obvious to everyone that he was a much happier man and finally at ease with himself.
He had created a new persona for himself. No longer was he this fearsome, threatening man. He was now a warm, cuddly teddy bear of a man.
Oh, these girls, the kissing preacher.
Although George was a reformed character, his love life was still a mess. His relationships tended to be short, although they eventually ended on good terms. George had several girlfriends and 4 wives before he found personal contentment. He had adopted his trademark bald head when he married for the 5th time. In 1985, Mary Martelli, his children's babysitter, became his wife.
She is truly his soulmate. She matches with him very well. I think she's an awesome woman because she was partially raising other women's children. She kind of bows out and lets him have the spotlight. She's the best for him.
Mary bore him 5 children in addition to the 5 he already had. George decided to bring them up in a strictly Christian way, which meant no earrings or trousers for the girls and no television for anyone. But he doted on them.
He'd go, "Georgetta, come here, and give me a hug or something." He was always really affectionate towards me.
Several of the children lived with their mothers, but they spent the summer holidays with George.
Let's say our grace. Amen.
Everything was always an event with the family. When you went to the grocery store, you have whatever you wanted. You know, it's like, okay, get what you want, get what you want. And even there was a period of time when we had, like, it could be Michi Day or George Jr. Day or, you know, Georgetta Day. Back then, he wasn't a boxer. So that was 24/7 of just daddy love.
With his first son, George, began an unusual tradition. He went on to name all his boys George. Some daughters, too, were given variations like Georgetta and Frida George.
I really wanted to give the kids something that they would never be able to fall away from. A name, something that they would have in common.
He told us that if one gets in trouble, that's all of us. You know, we always felt like we were responsible for the other.
George had a lot of Georges to take care of, but he had time for other people's children, too. In 1984, he had started the George Foreman Youth and Community Center.
A woman came and said, "George, I'm having trouble with my son. Is there any way that you could get him interested in boxing?" She knew his story and how boxing saved him.
When the boy went to jail, he felt guilty because he hadn't helped. So he established a refuge for the kind of wayward lad that he had been himself. George used his own money to equip it with exercise equipment, a boxing ring, and a basketball court. It was a safe place for kids to hang out. By 1987, 10 years after he retired from boxing, George's life was happy and settled. He was a preacher in a happy marriage and had his own modest church, as well as the youth center. Everything seemed perfect except for one small problem. George was running out of money. He came up with a surprising solution.
Say, "Thank you, Jesus." Thank you, Jesus.
In 1987, George Foreman was a 38-year-old happily married preacher with a youth center and a fast diminishing bank account.
I was going to have to close up this center or get some money. And I decided, look, I know how to get money. I'm going back into the ring. I'm going to be heavyweight champ of the world again.
He had hung up his boxing gloves 10 years before. The idea of a comeback was incredible.
I thought he was silly. To be honest, 10 years? The man is now making a comeback? 1987, at the age of 38? I'm going, best of luck, George.
The obstacles in the way of a comeback were formidable. He was so old, the Boxing Commission demanded many medical tests before granting him a license. And he was fat.
Liar, liar, you're a liar.
Nevertheless, in March 1987, he stepped into the ring again, for the first time in a decade, and defeated an unranked boxer.
Like the first night we met, I was the ring announcer. I, honest to God, thought I was in the Twilight Zone and I was in a time warp. And I thought, is this real? Is this real, or am I imagining all this?
No boxer had ever made a comeback after such a long absence, and derisive sports writers had a field day.
They'd say, "Oh, George, you too big, you too fat." So he said, "Well, if I can't hit him with my left, I can't hit him with my right, then I just belly bump him." So that became his thing.
George made the derision work for him. He turned the fat jokes into commercials, and made comedy out of his famous appetite to promote forthcoming fights.
George Foreman is hungry to fight again, and only HBO's got him.
The laughing stopped abruptly in 1994. Almost 20 years to the day after losing to Muhammad Ali in Zaire, 45-year-old George Foreman took on the reigning heavyweight champion, 26-year-old Michael Moorer.
We've written off George more times than the national debt, and we give him exactly 0 chance on the Richter scale.
But the old man knocked out the champion and recaptured the title nobody thought he could win. It felt as if George had beaten age itself.
Oh man, it was uproar. Oh, it was out of sight. Out of sight.
In the middle of the pandemonium, George went down on his knees and thanked God.
This was a prayer of thanks.
And then when he got up, we were all over him. We all wanted a piece of him. We all wanted to grab him and hug him and kiss him. And I mean, it was just, that's what happiness was.
Heavyweight champion of the world, Big George Foreman.
George's life had come full circle. He had reached the sweetest moment in the bright career his father J.D. had predicted.
We had a plan all that time.
George did not stop boxing until his mother died in 1998. She couldn't bear to see him fight, and she never did. Nevertheless, she had been his constant inspiration.
I lived for my mother. She was the reason I was boxing. I never box again. I'll never box again, never.
He doesn't need to. George has many other careers and is busier than ever.
Okay, I gotta go now. They told me to move on.
He's a boxing commentator for Home Box Office, best-selling autobiographer, advice columnist on health matters, and of course, a pitchman.
Proof 4 out of 5 George Foremans prefer the taste of new Doritos tortilla chips with more natural cheese flavor.
Who taught you kids how to eat like this?
You, Dad.
And then there's George Foreman's lean, mean grilling machine.
We're gonna knock the fat out.
The apron has made him more money than the boxing gloves. He is a multimillionaire who gives away many of his millions.
He is the absolute quintessential American success story. The guy who was born with nothing and he emerged out of it worth over $100 million. I mean, what more consequential American hero can you have?
The George Foreman story is far from over. George loves life too much for that. A father for the 10th time, he intends to live to 144. Who knows? With his lifelong habit of beating the odds, he may just astonish the world again and do it.
Hey, Dad.
George's belief is no matter how old you are, your life is never behind you, it's always ahead of you, and you can always live your dream.